Before I cut the tenons, I need to mark at least one of the parts. Now, ideally, I would have a test piece, which I very often forget to make. So I'm just going to cut the first tenon and mark the tenon on one of my side aprons. It's one I could probably most afford to lose, but ideally I'd have a test piece here. So what I need to do is mark the thickness of the tenon and the width of the tenon. So I'm going to just put this in the vise here, just make it easier to hold. My tenons are 1/4 inch thick, so I'll find the middle on here and then come out 1/8 of an inch on either side. And I think I'll use my combination square here to make sure that's centered. And yeah, that just needs to be pretty close to 1/4. I'm going to sneak up on the dimension on the table saw, so as long as I get in the ballpark so I can get my first setting of the height of the dado set, I should be fine. Now for the width of the tenon, I had said earlier I wanted to come in 3/8 of an inch on each side. But what I'm going to do is mark this width from a leg. That's going to make more sense since that's what I'm working with here. So I'm just going to put the leg like that, and I'm aligning this edge, right, because that's going to be flush with the top. And I'll mark, and I want to be just inside these this outer part of here. So about like that and like that. And that's, you know, just really going to give me a starting point. Once again, I'll set the height of the dado set on the saw as I'm cutting these, and then come back and check. That gets me the width and thickness of the tenon. The length of the tenon I'm going to set on the sled on the saw. So let's head over to the saw next. There are multiple ways to cut tenons. We can use a sled and a dado set to cut away the material. We could use a tenon jig, which actually holds the part vertical, and then cut them that way. We could use a router table. We're going to use the first method though, which is the dado stack with a sled. That's relatively straightforward. It's intuitive. It basically we're staying at one machine the whole time. So that's a relatively simple way to go. So we'll go ahead and install the dado set and then get started. So of course we'll start by taking off the throat plate. My saw has a little splitter there, and raise up the blade. And of course, to remove a blade, I'm going to use the wrench. Now, whenever you remove a blade on any spinning blade, you turn the nut the same way that the blade spins. That's how you remove a blade. So take the nut and the washer off, and very carefully take the blade off. I want to make sure I don't hit these carbide teeth on any of the metal parts because they chip very easily. And we're going to start with the left blade. So I'm going to set up a 3/4 inch dado stack, and so that means the two outer blades are 1/8. I'm going to put 2 1/8 inch chippers and a 1/4 inch chipper. So that will give me the two outer is 1/4, the 2 1/8 inch chippers are 1/4, and the 1/4 inch chippers, of course, 1/4. I try to make the setup symmetric so that I'm going to go blade, eighth, quarter, eighth blade. I want to make sure that the teeth here on the chipper are between teeth on the blade. Here's quarter, and I like to put these so they're symmetrically or radially located. So since there's going to be 3 chippers, I'll have them 60 degrees apart. Okay, now the other 1/8 inch chipper, and then I'll put the other blade on, being very careful. And once again, I can't see it here, but I've got the chipper tooth in between teeth on the blade. They don't have a lot of wiggle room there, so you really have to watch for that. Okay, now with most saws, there's not enough room for the washer to go on if you've got a 3/4 inch dado stack. So I'm just going to put the nut on directly. So I'm holding the blade. I'm going to tighten the nut by hand so it's a little bit snug, and then I'm going to put the wrench on, and I'm going to bring everything forward so the wrench is locked against the throat plate opening, and then I'm going to grab this whole dado stack and pull it towards me. So that should be nice and snug. I'm going to double check. So chipper, blade, chipper. The chipper teeth are in a gutlet, so that all looks good. So I'll switch out the throat plate for a dado throat plate. Now, once I'm all set up, I do want to turn the blade on just to make sure everything spins and it's everything's nice and tight. Okay, I'm going to grab a dado sled. So this is a little different than the sleds at school in that it does not have a front brace on it. But other than that, a sled's a sled. So I'm going to bring the blade up a little bit here. And we need to set the stop. So I've got a stop block and a clamp. Now I'm going to be cutting the tenons like this. So the tenons are going to be 1 inch long. Remember, I made the mortises 1 and like a 1/16. They're a little bit deep. That's assuming the tenons are 1 inch long. And of course, these parts were cut with that assumption. So I need to set the distance from this side of the blade to the stop to 1 inch. I can just set that like that. That's 1 inch. Double check. Okay, that looks great. A little extra insurance there. Okay, now the next thing I need to do is set the blade height. So I've got my piece here. Now, like I said, ideally this would be a test piece. And what I want to do, I want to find a flat top tooth. So most of these teeth are beveled, beveled out on either side. But this tooth is flat across the top. So what I'm going to do is lower the blade and then come up to my setting. You never want to go down to a setting. You always want to come up to a setting. So I'm going to raise it up till I'm just below my line. And then we'll sneak up. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to lock the blade height. And we'll give this a shot. So I'm checking the fit here, and it took 3 or 4 tries to get the fit correct. Notice I'm checking it in a couple of different mortises because that 1/4-inch bit that I used to make the mortises vibrated a little bit. So some of the mortises are slightly bigger or smaller than others. Note too that when I'm doing all these cuts, I'm always making sure that the bed of the sled is clean, and I'm trying to be very consistent with my pressure and my hand placement. Consistency is really key to making this work well. So I'm going to continue to make a few test cuts here until I get it right. And then once it's correct, I will continue making the rest of the cuts. I'm going to make the cut here complete on the whole length of the tenon so I can check better the fit. And once that's correct, I'll go ahead and cut the rest of the tenon. So starting at the end of the tenon, working towards the shoulder, and we'll check the fit now that I can get the whole tenon in. That's feeling pretty good. It's a little bit snug, but I'm going to live with that. Notice I lick my fingers sometimes. That's because my skin tends to be a little dry, and licking my fingers allows me to grab the workpiece a little better. Otherwise, my hand tends to slip on it. Okay, all the tenons are cut to thickness now. Now, one thing I should point out, notice when I was cutting the tenons, I did not start with the material against the stop and then move away from the stop. I always move towards the stop. Okay, the reason for that is on some sleds, it's possible this side is slightly higher than this side. You know, just from use or abuse or whatever. Sometimes that's the case. And the problem is if this side is higher than this side and you make your first cut, then when you pull the material away, it drops off of this one and actually drops a little bit lower. And then you end up with a stepped tenon there. So I always start away from the stop, and then by the time I get over to the stop, it clears the tenon. That's my sled. There's things nice and flat, so it wouldn't have mattered. But I think it's a good habit to work towards the stop. Okay, the next step is to cut the tenon to width. Now I've remarked one of my parts here. And what I want to do is, once again, find a flat top tooth like that. And I'm going to raise the blade a little bit here. And this width is not that critical. We just want to make sure, I can move the part up and down a little bit to align it with the top of the leg. So the width will be slightly smaller than the width of my mortise. So that looks about right. Now, one thing that can be a problem is if this cut isn't perfectly square, or if my stop isn't perfectly square, or perhaps something else isn't perfectly square, what can happen is if I now come over to here and cut the tenon to width, I have seen it where you end up putting a little bit of a notch right here because this isn't coming back to the same spot as it was when it was here, right? If this stop was slightly angled, then this material is going to hit differently here than if I hit it like that. And similarly, if this was slightly angled, right, that's different than that. So to be on the safe side here, I want to move this a little bit away from the stop, and then we'll trim that, even that up with a sharp chisel. If everything's square, which actually it does look like it on my sled here, I think I'd be fine. But the way to get around that is we need to move this slightly away from the stop. So I'm going to put a few thicknesses of tape there. If I had too little tape, it would be such a small amount, it would be difficult to trim. So 3 pieces should be adequate to do the job. So now when I put that up against there, it's far enough away where I'm certain I'm not going to cut into the face of my apron here. Okay, so all the tenons are cut. Now, before you tear down your setup, I would strongly suggest you look at all your parts and make sure that you've made all of your cuts. I've had quite a few people tear down a setup and then realize once they get back in the bench lab that they forgot to make one cut, and to set this all back up again would be a real pain. So I think I'm all good to go. I'm going to leave this set up because I actually need it again in a minute. But let's go finish up these tenons. Okay, so two things we have to do now to the tenons. Trim off that little bit of material we left, and we also have to round the edges of the tenon. So if we take a look at how that's going to fit in there, you can see I've left myself a little bit of wiggle room there, but I still need to knock these corners down a little bit. So I'm going to put that in a vise. And what I'm going to do, I've got a pattern maker's rasp, which is a fairly fine rasp, but unlike a wood rasp, which looks like that, much coarser. You see the teeth are in rows. That's not going to work for this. Here you can see the teeth are a little more random. So what I want to do is I'm going to use this to create a chamfer on each edge there. And that little extra material is actually going to help when I do this because it protects the shoulder of the tenon. I'm maybe rubbing the rasp on there a little bit. So once I've got 2 fairly symmetric chamfers there, then I'm going to come in and I'm going to just knock those corners down a little bit. And that gives me a nice rounded tenon. Now, while I'm still in this position, I'm going to come in with a chisel and from either side, there we go, and trim off that little high spot there. Now the rasp doesn't reach all the way down to the bottom there, so I can clean that up. With a chisel. Notice the chisel I'm using, I want a chisel that's narrower than the thickness of the apron. If it was wider, I can actually mess this up by cutting into that corner there. So again. I got my finger down here also protecting that.